Hello, everyone. This is Jim Gerzon, and I want to welcome you to day 47 of Humanity Rising. Every day since the 22nd of May, we've been broadcasting live to about 15,000 people through our live streaming partners on our Facebook page, YouTube channel, and variety of other channels to create essentially an open space for 2 hours a day so that people can come together and share their thoughts and feelings, their fears and anxieties, their hopes and dreams as we all go through this extraordinary pandemic. This is an unprecedented moment in human history. Everyone, literally everywhere, is going through the same experience. And one of the extraordinary consequences of that is it's put all of us in the same conversation. This is the first time in my life where you don't have to convince people of almost anything. People know we're in the pandemic. And they know that we need to use this crisis as an opportunity to somehow fashion a world that is more sustainable and resilient and abundant and healthy and in alignment with natural systems. The extraordinary paradox and irony of our current situation is that while there are millions of NGOs and hundreds of millions of individuals around the world that are working tirelessly day in and day out for a better world, the major indicators at the center of which is runaway climate change are all getting worse. And scientists the world over are saying that we're literally running out of time to change the world around. So the central question around which Humanity Rising has been convened is really this question of how do the progressive forces around the world come together with sufficient efficacy and purpose and clarity that we can actually make a difference at this critical time. We haven't proven ourselves able to do that yet, and we must. And this gives rise to the issue we're going to delve into today, and that's the issue of leadership. How do we lead? Who must lead? What do we do in the middle of a pandemic? If you look back over history, people have popped up as leaders in all kinds of strange and mysterious ways. You can be a king and not a leader. You can still be a teenager, as Alexander the Great was, and in a move considered foolhardy by all of his advisors, launch an invasion of Persia, the mightiest nation in the world. Why did he prevail? According to all his contemporaries, when it came to the battlefield, no one understood the battlefield more than Alexander the Great. Completely unsuspected leader. One thinks of Marie Curie in the early 20th century, the wife of a chemist who had this vision about radioactivity and ended up being the only person in all of Nobel Prize history to get 2 different Nobel Prizes in 2 different subjects. She led because of her vision. One thinks of Rosa Parks. No one had ever heard of Rosa Parks. But when she refused to go to the back of the bus, she ignited the civil rights movement. Not through proactive leadership, but by a passive, no, I am not going to do that. And Martin Luther King called her the queen of the civil rights movement. One thinks of Mandela in prison, completely vanquished by the apartheid state. And as he sat there in the silence of his own mind, something began to transmute who he was. And he ended up president of the new South Africa. One thinks of Trump, who is leading by destroying. So there's all kinds of positive and negative leaders, different styles of leadership. And how we understand this mysterious quality of leadership, sometimes so unpredictable, so surprising as to who pops up to lead, what groups coalesce to lead. And then we ask ourselves the question, given the urgency of the moment, what does leadership mean in a world that is careening out of control, within which we have a diminishing time frame to change the situation around? What does leadership have to be to do that? Are we beyond the realm of individual leader? Are we in a situation where only collective leadership will prevail? These are deep, deep questions without easy answers. But the question of leadership, my friends, is a seminally critical issue that we must ponder, because lead we must if we're going to save civilization as we know it. I would like to now introduce a good friend, Andre van Eegen, who's had a very distinguished career in public service, most recently as the Chief Executive Officer of Synergos Institute, based in New York City, which for the last 20, 25 years has been working in extraordinary ways to develop leadership among people all around the world. Henry will begin our program. He's convened a very distinguished panel. So Henry, thank you for joining, and I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you for that great introduction. And thanks for all of you joining today. Just last weekend, I celebrated as a Dutchman in Harlem, which is part of Manhattan in New York, with my US friends Independence Day. I also realized that it could have been, instead of an Independence Day from the British, Independence Day from the Dutch. What does history tell us? In 1626, the Dutch head of the West Indies companies, Peter Minuit, purchased what is now Manhattan Island from the Lenape and began constructing the port of New Amsterdam. That led also to the establishment of New Netherland, which today is New York State, parts of Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey. Later on, in 1664, Dutch Governor Peter Stuyvesant surrenders New Amsterdam to the British. Though Stuyvesant was at least outwardly prepared to fight, prominent city residents persuaded him to stand down, and on September 8, he signed the colony over without any blood being shed. 9 years later, in 1673, during the Third Anglo-Dutch War, the Dutch reconquered Manhattan with an invasion force of some 600 men. But they gave it up the following year as part of a peace treaty in which they got Suriname in South America. They thought that was going to be worth more, but they were wrong. But what if that would not have happened? Is it conceivable that we would have been speaking Dutch today and that Americans would have been liberated from the Dutch? Well, I dare say, as a Dutchman, I'm glad we don't. If for no other reason, the English language is so much richer. The only remnant left over from this is the fact that some 1,500 words remain in the English language that have a Dutch origin. One of the most well-known is Yankee. And so, there are many more what-if questions. Indeed, what if the Dutch had never gone to the US and the British? What would have become of the original inhabitants, the Lanake? That question, what if, is a relevant one today. It is the question whether we change ourselves, unlearning some of our habits, better recognizing the lived experiences of others, and build bridges for a more peaceful and regenerative future for us and our grandchildren. So let us explore that what if question more. The pandemic has operated like an X-ray on societies across the world and has clearly revealed weaknesses and imbalances along economic, gender, and ethnic fault lines, with social media exposing areas that were previously unseen. Visualizations of blatant racism and other serious issues in our societies has woken us up, and we are longing for justice and less inequality. Amazingly enough, other actors, including civil society and business, are at the center of that conversation. At the center because governments around the world are not articulate enough or sensitive enough or indeed informed enough to contribute positively to this conversation. So out of nowhere, these actors are starting to change the discourse in the world. The question, of course, is, will these changes last? And will we as a global community not just jump into action modus, but also reflect on our own role, our own prejudices, and our own negative contribution to the environment, the pandemic, and racism, to just name a few? We must reinvent and reimagine our own lives as we speak. If we want lasting and systemic change, it will have to start with ourselves. The spirit of this time forces us into a surprising combination of accepting our lack of control while at the same time empowering ourselves to believe we can make a better world. Indeed, everything I do contributes to society, and everything that I don't do will be withheld from society. We must see our individual strength and values as part of the bigger picture. For me, it leads to a higher consciousness and more positive energy or love, and a great need to unlearn. I realized this as I was dealing with my own prejudices. Recently, I was deeply moved by the actions of a pastor in Berlin who reached out to the Muslim community as Ramadan came to an end. Due to social distancing, there simply wasn't enough room in the mosque for prayer. The pastor offered the church and even moved the pews out of the church. And in a final gesture of interconnectedness, prayed together with the Muslims in the church. I was so moved by this story and talked to my wife about this, noting that it were not just women leaders who were truly showing us the way, like from Norway, New Zealand, Germany, Taiwan, South Korea, Estonia, and Finland, but that there were some male leaders doing the same, only to find out that the pastor is a woman. How it made me realize that we need more women in leadership positions, that we need a fundamental shift. It is also the realization that I know so little. I need to listen more deeply to others. Indeed, I encourage you all to share your wisdom and comments in the time that we have together today. I want to especially encourage our younger audience. So often we work for youth, while really we need to work with youth. You are indeed part of the solution, and in many ways, much more legitimate as stakeholders around this table. As we unlearn, we need to see reality from different points of view, just like quantum mechanics. If we zoom out, there is always a pattern to be seen from which we can draw conclusions. But we also need to go back to the most basic elements with which we can create the new cohesion. Sometimes we look a bit further into the future. We are on our way to an era of dynamic cohesion, where holistic bridging leaders show us direction, where the circular becomes the new linear, and where we genuinely realize that we are interconnected. It is the strength of the smallest link that defines how the chain will grow. The post-COVID world demands a different type of leadership. As the old system crumbles, society will become characterized by the strength of its smallest link. By doing so, we can transform how people across sectors come together, learn, create shared vision, and take collective action to bring about social change based on trust. This requires us to develop new abilities, including mental resilience, emotional intelligence, and the skill to collaborate, even with those with whom we may not agree. And for me personally, also spiritual growth. We need to unlearn and bridge divides and build trust. The fundamental question may be to understand how to leverage the crisis as an opportunity for human renewal and increased resilience to future challenges and a more sustainable world. Indeed, we share similar feelings about our well-being, anxieties about survival, and questions about how we are going to rebuild beyond. We're moving from a simple market-based morality toward a more public morality. And this new public morality is revealing that the demands we put on society, we also put on ourselves. If we individually strive for more, we end up collectively with less. So, will we grasp this opportunity to change how the world works and address pressing challenges that include global inequality and climate change? Or when the health crisis passes, will things return to the way they were? Will we miss an opportunity to change how the global economy functions for the welfare of us all? Or As Jeffrey Sachs wrote, the world is headed for a period of massive disruption without any leadership. So, what if not? So what if we decide that change needs to happen right now? What if the experimentation in my home country with the donut model in Amsterdam works, moving away from the misconception that economic growth is what matters, and instead is based on thriving as human beings that matters? What if the BLM movement really leads to fundamental change in inequity in our societies? What if social actors and companies manage to turn around a situation where demagogic leadership and narcissism are impeding a solution, like in Brazil? What if truly change the course of climate change once and for all? Coming back to my own situation, I can say that over the past months, I've been thrilled with the way our organization, Synergos, has become more agile, more empowered, and that I have been part of some deep conversations and some deep unlearning. Indeed, I realized that before moving into our action modus, we need to pause, to reset the clock of humanity and our world. Let us examine our own role in self-reflection, realizing that at most we know but a very small portion of all the wisdom. Let us pause, yield, and listen, listening to the emerging future, yielding to the power that is enabling this fundamental change. Let us reconnect to ourselves and one another and examine what we can bring to the table, to what we can contribute. Indeed, let us just pause for 1 minute and ask ourselves one of the following questions, and I will share with you the questions. What needs to change in our own behavior so we may contribute our fullest self? If our own world should be a reflection of the world we want to create, what does that own world look like? What will I give up or struggle most with giving up in order to increase our collective well-being? Let us now take 1 minute and reflect on one of these questions. I will now stop sharing. That was my clock going off. I have here in our virtual room, and please do put on your video and 5 great leaders. 5 people who are contributing to a changing world and who realize so well that we are all but a small part of the whole. 5 leaders in their own field who will share their wisdom and self-reflection. They have been challenged to ask each other a truly personal and tough question without sharing the question beforehand. You will soon hear the answers and the question. And in the meantime, I ask you to prepare your questions and comments for these panelists. Questions that will uncover this new world and this new direction. Let us now listen first to Funmi Olonisakin, Suzanne Davis, Paul Polman, Scilla Elworthy, and Mark Gerzon, whose bio you have already received. Paul, can I ask you to ask Suzanne your question?
With pleasure, and thanks, Henry. As a fellow Dutchman, we do regret this real estate deal that we sold for $25. So I do agree with you on that one. But it didn't turn out to be too bad for the Dutch after all either, if you look at their national happiness and quality of life. And that's what we need to get everywhere. The question for Suzanne is very simple. She's had an amazing career and still has in a lot of areas in the social enterprise sector with Bragg, with Ramin. Many of us have seen some of your talks you've given, your TED Talk, etc. And my question is very simple. How can we use the social sector better and faster to drive the change at scale in the private sector? And reflecting on what you've done and the involvement you've had in many of these areas, what would you think is needed to do differently moving in this respect?
Thank you, Paul. I'd say maybe we could try cloning you. There's very few business leaders that have the clarity and courage to speak and act the way you do. And I think chairing the International Chamber of Commerce and your active involvement in championing the Global Compact with the UN SDGs has been really important. You know, it's not just taking Unilever, a big company, and trying to really redirect it towards serious sustainability. I think opening up the business world to this new concept of stakeholder societies. I don't really call it stakeholder capitalism, although lots of people are talking about reimagining capitalism. And I think that's the success of the social entrepreneurs that have been working away over the centuries, trying to insist that business be a force for good. It's crazy that we even have to frame a question or a hypothesis, are businesses a force for good or not? You know, because many people will say, well, they create jobs, so of course there's inherent goodness. But we have operated in a way that has been so blind, I think, to the real purpose of business, of creating an economy that works for all of us. So what more can we do? Well, I think moving towards collaborative plays so that industries can accelerate their transformation. And I think more direct engagement and partnerships with the social entrepreneurs like Eunice, who has been saying, look, not all people are driven by the profit motive. In fact, some of us really get off on just doing things that our hearts sing. So that's part of the process. How can we allow every person who's engaged in business also have their heart sing? And those kinds of strategic partnerships then call for people to harness their consumer power so that every time I shop, it reflects my values. Every investment I make reflects my values. Every opportunity to engage in our market economy and becomes a bridge to the world we want to create and not a reinforcement of the status quo. But really, I could ask Scilla Elworthy that question and more. I think your career has just been fascinating for me, Scilla, as I have read the 2 books that you've written about awakened leadership and a business plan for peace, as well as listened to your TED Talks. And I noticed that you married a South African still during the time of apartheid. So I know you've had quite a journey from growing up in Great Britain. I wonder, you've challenged us to face our fears. You've challenged us to try to use our anger to fuel our work for a peaceful world. So how do you think the rise of feminine intelligence over the last 6 months has created a different kind of path in response to these 3 intersecting crises, the global pandemic, racism, and our unsustainable economic system? And what would you say to people listening on how they could take a leap of consciousness? And I don't know, have you unlearned anything in the last months?
Oh, Susan, thank you for that great question. I'm really with Einstein, who said we can't solve the problems that face us using the consciousness that created them. So now is the time when a huge shift or lift, more than a lift, it's really a leap in consciousness is what's needed. And I'm convinced, and I think from the way you put the question and what Henri said earlier, is that one of the things we have to do is rebalance feminine intelligence with masculine intelligence. And this, I'm not talking gender, because feminine intelligence is available equally to men as it is to women. But when we've seen in the last little while what women presidents and prime ministers were able to do like that in the instance, as soon as their countries were faced with the pandemic, I was really impressed. I mean, President Tsai Ing-wen in Taiwan, back in January, at the very first sign of a problem, she introduced 124 measures to block the spread of the virus without having to resort to lockdowns. And that has become common elsewhere, 7 deaths only. Jacinda Ardern, I'm sure you're aware of, and Henri mentioned this, in New Zealand, she was very early to move to lockdown and crystal clear on the maximum level of alert she was putting the country under. And why she was doing it, she really explained that, 22 deaths only. Iceland, under the leadership of Prime Minister Katrin Jakobsdóttir, offered free coronavirus testing to all citizens and instituted a thorough tracking system. So she was obviously well prepared. And that means they haven't had to lock down or shut schools, 10 deaths. So I'm quoting this because there's a whole list of feminine leaders or feminine thinking leaders, including men, who've been able to tackle by seeing ahead what this crisis was going to visit upon us. And we've yet to deal with the unemployment that's going to be a result. And so I think that what you're raising is an absolutely key issue. And if I may, I would just like to reflect on women's, the importance of including women in peace negotiations. Because as you probably know from the UN figures, when they tracked it down in 2009, women were only 2.5% of signatories to peace agreements. And the result most agreements didn't last more than 5 years. Yet when the percentage of women rises even up to 10%, the agreement is likely to last 15 years or longer. And when I saw these stats, I asked myself, why? What is it that women are doing? And from my experience in peace building, what I realized was that a major reason for the effectiveness of their participation is because while warlords at a peace table are haggling over resources, votes, positions in the forthcoming government, what women bring to the peace table, in this case, is what they've had to carry. And that is what you might call the fallout or the debris of war, namely the orphans, the widows, the bereaved, those who haven't even been buried yet, and those who are suffering from PTSD. And it's only if the traumatized and the victims of war their problems are addressed that you can stop the cycle of violence going round again. That's very well realized now. So to try to answer your question, I do think it's to do with rebalancing feminine intelligence with masculine. And now, if I may, I would like to be bold enough to ask one of my heroes a question, and that's Paul Polman. And Paul, I was listening to a broadcast you made last night with Margaret Heffernan, and it really brought home to me the magnitude of what you have dared to do in your many years leading Unilever. So I wanted to ask you, in our experience with local peace builders who are able to stop armed violence, and they're at the sharp end, the most effective of those leaders are the ones who've had a regular practice of self-inspection and faced their own fear. So I wanted to ask you, in your experience, in what ways can self-aware leaders at the top end of the spectrum, and you're a very good example of the kind of person I mean, how can they most effectively use their courage, even their vulnerability, to build a more peaceful future?
Paul, you're muted. Can you please unmute yourself?
Yeah. No, I was just saying to Scilla that I thank her for a question and good to see her again. And thank her for all the things she is doing. But what is very clear in the corporate world is that we don't have the leaders that we aspire to have. If you look at the average tenure of a CEO now for one of the major companies, it has gone down to well below 5 years, 4.5 years to be exact. And a lifetime of a publicly traded company is 17 years. And what we've seen in the COVID crisis, regretfully, is that the turnover of CEOs has gone higher. And I think one of the reasons is that we have created different types of leaders where success was defined clearly not in line with the needs of humanity and in line with the needs of nature, may I say, or planet Earth, where businesses were entirely driven by shareholder primacy as a purpose. And as we all know by now, that's not a successful long-term strategy. Despite that, we've seen some great leaders emerging in the business community that have taken the courage. And I always remind ourselves that the word courage actually comes from the French word cœur, which is actually the heart. So what you really need is leaders that can work with the brain without any question, but also leaders with the heart. And there's an increasing group of people, I think, that are capable of doing that are more purpose-driven, that realize, frankly, that they've won a lottery ticket of life and are the fortunate ones, and that they need to put themselves to the service of others. And it is these moral leaders, I think, that are being celebrated increasingly more, and the moral leadership style that is actually paying off. It's very clear that to be a good leader, you probably first and foremost have to be a good human being, but then you only become a leader, in my experience at least, the moment you realize that it's not about yourself, and that by putting yourself to the service of others, you actually are better off yourself as well. And only when you get to that point, which even in my own case took a while, it was really when I started working with, at the request of Secretary Ban Ki-moon at that time from the United Nations, to work on the Sustainable Development Goals, that I started to grasp a little bit more the complexities of the issues and the role that the private sector could and should play to solve the things. And one of the things that we did in Unilever at that time was come out with a business model that said you need to decouple your growth from environmental impact and optimize or maximize your overall social impact. Move to a business model that has a positive footprint, not a slightly less bad footprint. Less bad is just simply not good enough anymore, or not doing damage is not good enough anymore either. We are really in need of moving to a regenerative state. And clearly we didn't have all the answers and we couldn't do it alone. So by coming out there and saying literally, we don't know how to solve this and we need your help, we sort of became a human company, and people were starting to come to us, not with criticism, not with demands, but with a willingness to work together to solve these issues, which none of us can do alone. Mm-hmm. And it's that exposure that you might call exposure, or it's actually strengths at the end of the day. I've always taken the position in whatever job I'm doing that I'm probably the one that knows the least. If you run a company like Unilever, you have your finance person is probably more skilled in finance, and your marketing person more skilled in marketing. The people who run your factories know more about it. So all you can actually do is ensure that these others are successful. And if you expand that territory of others to the people that we serve, to humanity, and increasingly to the planet, I actually think that you find more opportunities to be long-term successful. It certainly was the case for us. But I also think in this COVID crisis, once more, companies that were run with a higher social consciousness, the ESG, environmental social governance, have actually seen themselves perform better as well, even to the shareholders, as they actually focus on the other stakeholders. So it's profits through purpose, it's not profits with purpose. It's these longer term multi-stakeholder models. It's this partnership, it's this purpose-driven model. And as you rightfully said, these skills that are needed to do that are probably more given, and I don't know if it's given is the right word, but you find them more in the female gender than you do in the male gender. And it's very clear that during this crisis as well, once more, the countries run by females, but also many of the institutions like Christiana or Christine Lagarde and many others seem to be able to deal better with this. Mm-hmm. So investing in that leadership is probably the most important thing we can do, because we're still terribly short. I've always believed that we have been very forewarned about the things that are going to happen. We've also been very forearmed with a lot of tools to do some things about it. We know how to build houses, yet we have homeless. We know how to grow food without cutting the trees. We know how to feed people, yet we have many starving. And yet we waste 30-40%. We know how to do now green energy in many of the places. So frankly, the answers to create this more inclusive, sustainable economy are here, but we're just blind. You know, I work a lot with the blind and deafblind in one of my foundations that Kim and myself started. But it was Helen Keller who went to Perkins School for the Blind in Boston, Massachusetts. And she was blind and deaf, and she was often asked how horrible this is. And she said, no, it's not horrible to be blind. The worst thing is to have eyes and not be able to see. And unfortunately, we still have too many people that have eyes and are not able to see. So with that, I have to hand it over to Henry, I think.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. I want to actually hand it over to Mark, because Mark has prepared a question for Funmi.
Funmi, it's a pleasure to ask you a question. And I've been an admirer of your work and an admirer of the African Leadership Center and an admirer of the work you've done in the peace building field. And what I'm excited to ask you about is a question that's been on my mind ever since I heard President Chissano of Mozambique many years ago, former President Chissano. He was at the Carter Center and he spoke after the World Bank president, Jim Wolfenson, spoke. And it had been all this stuff about rich countries helping poor countries, rich countries helping poor countries. And Chissano came to the podium and he said, we've heard a lot about rich countries helping poor countries, but how do poor countries help rich countries? He said, in Africa, we believe in reciprocity. You know, I haven't heard much about that. And the room was totally silent. And so I'm delighted to be able to ask you, Funmi, how do you see leadership between what we call rich countries and what we call poor countries? How do you specifically, what are the real gifts that you can see from American and European leadership? And what are the gifts that you can see from African leadership? And if you had to address Chissano's question, which is what's the reciprocity in the world that we need between different kinds of leaders in different parts of the world, I would love to listen to you talk about that. How can leaders in different parts of the world draw out the best of each other and recognize the best in each other? Thank you so much for taking that question, Funmi.
Thank you so much, Mark. I think that's a vitally important question. And I don't think I've actually heard that question phrased, you know, I heard a question like that, which I think it's a really powerful question. And it's not surprising that it's President Chissano that will, you know, would have inspired that kind of question. But really, frankly, if I take some of my own observations from the peace building environment, I think what we see the least is the real expansiveness of knowledge, of wisdom in the societies that are afflicted by poverty and armed conflict. We tend to see certain power dynamics and certain styles of leadership, whether institutionally or personally, from, if you like, rich countries. I mean, I worked in the United Nations for a short period of time in the office of the Special Representative for Children Affected by Armed Conflict. And that was between 1999 and 2003. And in that short period of time, as an academic, I was taken outside of my comfort zone to really see the practical realities of conflict on the ground. And we, count myself amongst those people, acting on behalf of, if you like, the more privileged, the more powerful nations of the world. We would go to those poor countries with ready-made ideas, ready-made agendas, because it always seemed to me, in hindsight, it seemed to me like what we were saying is, if only you were like us, if only you had ideas like ours, you won't be so poor, you won't be afflicted by war, and so on. And we had ready-made packages for them. I was struck by Scilla's point around you know, war, the cycles of war after every 5 years or 15 years. We've seen this in 44% of cases still. As she said, it will be 10 to 15 years before the cycle of armed conflict comes back. And therefore, we constantly took lessons to those places. And to a certain extent, there was an exchange of influence between leaders. We will sit in meetings sometimes and say, who are the good guys? We had even framed the good guys around those that were more like us, that we went to school with. They were in Oxford, they were in Cambridge, Harvard, wherever they were. You know, we seemed to share the same worldviews. It seemed, you know, now in hindsight. And so we packaged responses based on our own worldviews, based on our own ideas and agendas. And I think in that process, we missed that reciprocity. We missed what could have come from those countries that had, you know, long histories of peacemaking, of peace building. But those histories may not have been from the point of view of the institutions. These are new nations most of the time, colonized with relatively new governments, many of those governments and systems still less than 80 years old in many parts of the world, particularly in Africa, still well under 70 years. So because we framed the world through our own eyes, we missed what they could give back to us. We missed lessons of peace and peace building from the long history and long experiences. And if I were to say that, what I see today is a convergence between the rich and the poor countries. And those convergence, that convergence is not really between the institutions that we have. We still look at our democracies in these countries in the global north as far more superior. We do not see, Scilla's point about those who responded the most, the best to this pandemic so far, and the kinds of leadership values, ethics, and styles from them begins to tell us something that is different about now. Rich and poor countries are exchanging experiences and lessons, giving back to each other, but it's not their governments that are doing so. It is their people. It is the peoples of the world that are exchanging those gifts of ideas and experiences. And if there's any lesson that we need to take away with us at this moment, as we think about a post-COVID world, is that the best ideas are sitting on the margins of our governments, of our states. They're transnational in nature, and they're based on the best exchanges of science, of ideas, of kindness and principles between peoples from poor countries and rich countries. And I like this program for the fact that it just might help us open the doors to those exchange of ideas and values. That's a question that will get me thinking for some time. I want to thank you for it. I would reflect on it and take it back to my classroom. And with that in mind, I want to maybe I'll talk to Mark about this. My question for you, it might be related, it's very much related to this actually in a very interesting way. I was going to ask, given all of the, all of your own work, thinking about, if you like, the global common good, ideas of peace and justice, and the constituencies of actors, the range, and I am quite impressed with this. I think there's so much to learn from it. The constituencies of actors you've dealt with, where have you seen, and it's two things at the same time in terms of lessons that we can take forward, Mark. When you think of where you've seen mutuality, the best common ground between people, the things that have brought them together, and you compare it to the things that have divided them the most, what stands out in your mind about the issues or the things? I don't want to just say issues, it might be a thing around which people have converged. Where have you seen it, and what lesson do you take from that?
Well, it's a beautiful question, Funmi. Thank you. It is related to the question I asked you, and what I'm delighted about, I realize, is that we haven't rehearsed these. So we're all in our right brains. I mean, this is what's interesting to me. We're all in our right brains. None of us could prepare. So I have all these notes on a piece of paper here, and they're of no use at all, right? Because Funmi asked me a question that I didn't know. So that's great. And I think what strikes me immediately, and there's a connection, is that I think the right brain was present and the heart was present. Going back to Scilla's data about, peace deals that last for less than 5 years and peace deals that last for a long time. I think when the heart is present and when the right brain is present, things last longer. Things are grounded. When they're just in the head, when they're just strategic, when they're just that kind of mental strategy, they don't seem to last long. And for me, the points that have been made by many of the speakers, going back to Paul Pullman, who said, we can't do it alone. And the whole ethos of Synergos, which is bridging leadership, that whole ethos, I think, is right brain and heart. It's recognizing, and I think that's where my question to you, Funmi, came from, which was, it's so clear to me. If it's not clear to the world yet, it should be clear now. America is only a leader in some very small ways. In some very specific small ways, America's a beautiful leader. But in other ways, America is lost. America is lost. and it needs leadership from others, and I think that's probably true for every culture. Every culture has a gift. And so I think my answer to your question, Funmi, is that I see mutuality when people recognize that they have a gift that's a piece of the puzzle, and that everyone else has a piece, and that the only way we're going to solve these questions is when we bring those pieces together. If you'll allow me a quick sports story. Yes. I was once with a man named Pat Riley, who was the coach for the Los Angeles Lakers, and there were 8 people running for president in the United States at that time. This was 1992, and I said, "What do you think of these 8 candidates for president?" He said, "I wouldn't have any of them on my team." And I said, "Well, why not? Why wouldn't you have any of them on your basketball team?" He said, "Because I make my players sign a covenant that they'll bring out the best in each other. And these guys are bringing out the worst in each other." And so for me, that would be if I had to sum it up in a sentence, for me, that would be it probably, is when in our hearts or in our right brains, depending on how you want to put it, we recognize that we need to bring out the best in each other for things to work out. Then I think we find that mutuality, that common ground. And right now in the United States, we have a leadership that's exactly the opposite at the highest level. It's all about what's in it for me, what's in it for me, what's in it for me and my people. And that, all of us, as I look at your faces, all of us know that's the wrong way to go. And I guess a question I'll throw back to you, Henri, if you're, I'm not sure what happens next, but I'll pass it back to you with the question and just say that for me, the real question is, we know so much about leadership. We know so much about leadership, about what kind of leadership works and what kind of leadership doesn't work. And yet again and again, in country after country, we go back to the leadership that doesn't work. And if I had a question for all of you, it would be, can anybody explain to me why that's happening? Why, when we've had examples like Hitler or Pol Pot or Idi Amin or you name it, I'm using historical figures. It's like we know there's a kind of leadership that doesn't work, and yet we go back to it again and again and again and again. So with that, I turn it back to you, Henri, and Funmi, thank you so much for the question.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for all the panelists. I'm not sure I have that answer, Mark. I think that's a really complex question, and it may be partly also determined on very much an ecosystem within which that happens. But I'm not a sociologist. I hope somebody has written about it. If there is somebody in the panel who does feel that they have the capacity to answer this really complex question, why is it that we seem to elevate so often leaders who are in the end not very able to do what they're supposed to do as a leader, then just raise your hand. I mean, Funmi would probably be a person who could talk to that. Maybe Scilla could talk to that, if you're willing to talk to it. Otherwise, I have a few observations which I would love to. Which I heard from Funmi. The best ideas are on the margin, and I like that. And it's also in the chat. I see that sort of coming back too. So I would like to ask somebody in the panel who's willing to sort of address that. So how is it that we create a situation where we bring in more that wisdom and those ideas from the fringes where many of those ideas are? I mean, I see it happening at the moment because there's such enormous energy right now, and you see things coming up and being discussed like they've never been before. But what are some of the ways that we could do that? If there's somebody who wants to take it, just take it, just unmute you and take the question.
Well, I'll just shine a spotlight on 2 people if I could, Paul Pullman and Scilla Elworthy, because as far as I can tell, both of them, probably everybody, but certainly the 2 of them have done exactly what you said, Henri. Scilla would reach out to groups doing peace work at the grassroots with Peace Direct and empower them and recognize they had the answer to what to do on the ground. The answer wasn't in London. The answer wasn't in Washington. The answer was on the ground with the group on the ground, and Scilla and Peace Direct reached out and elevated their voices. And Paul, in a very different context, just in a moment ago said, Paul said, everybody on my team knows more than I do. I thought that was a beautiful summary. Everybody on my team knows more than I do. My job is to coordinate all those people who know more than I do about what they do. So those are just two examples. But to me, the kind of bridging leadership we're talking about, or awakened leadership or feminine leadership, whatever we want to call it, is doing just what Scilla and Paul illustrated. And I bet Funmi and Susan would say the same thing. But that's my first thought. Thank you.
Mark, oh, sorry, Paul, you go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I just want to pick up on what Mark said there, because I do believe that the common sense and the wisdom that we need now is coming from the bottom up, not the top down. The more I look at many of the leaders we have, they are flailing, they're insecure, therefore they're making very, very dodgy decisions. And what we pick up from the grassroots level of peace building, ordinary people who risk their lives in conflict situations so that other people don't get killed, what they are using is what I would call inner power. And that's because most of them, the most effective ones, have faced their own fear, their own shadow, their own weaknesses, if you like. And that's what enables them to be present when the crisis hits, instead of floundering or grasping for easy, trite non-solutions. And so I do believe that if our present leaders were obliged or encouraged to have a session every week where they listen to a panel of grassroots leaders, including the young leaders on the environment particularly, they might begin to hear what the world needs. Paul.
No, actually, you made my point. I wanted to say that the best thing to think about in business terms, if you want to, is to not be an inside-out company. Most of the companies are senders. I make things, you need to buy it. And if you don't buy it, I'll spend a little bit more money to convince you to buy it. And if you then still don't buy it, there must be something wrong with you. If you want to be successful, you want to be an outside-in company. But even as human beings, we want to be an outside-in company. In good company, the word company actually comes from breaking bread together. It got eroded over time by corrupt thinking, if you want to. But to be in good company is an honor. It is to respect others, to share. So if you could make a company an outside-in company, I don't think that good ideas are only on the fringes. I just think we've isolated the fringes by not just basically being senders instead of receivers. So if you could achieve that in corporate terms, but also in your own lives, you're so much better for it. The question here is a different one, actually, because there's a book that just came out, Kind Humans, I think it's called, or Humankind, by a Dutch writer, Rutger Bregman. And his thesis is that all human beings are essentially good. And I believe that. I believe that we are all here as God's perfect child to some extent, having a diamond in ourselves that might or might not shine. And yet collectively, we're not able to behave the way that we actually should behave for the collective good. And why is that? And I think too many discussions are around leadership, but at the end of the day, the leadership is often influenced by the boundaries in which we operate. And because our life has become so self-centered and short-term, especially in politics, but also in business, we deal with symptoms, we never address underlying causes. And we don't spend enough time moving these boundaries for people and for leadership to blossom. And that's really the task of a leader also in a company. In Unilever, I wasn't running the day-to-day business. There were quite a lot of very capable people able to do this. I was trying to move the boundaries so that people could grow, and could grow not only in the business terms, but obviously coming from their own inner core, from their own strengths and from their own characters. So we need to spend more time on debating what these boundaries are that prevent us from doing the right things. And if we could focus on those, it would unleash an enormous amount of energy to achieve quite a lot of things that obviously are now badly needed.
Suzanne, would you like to contribute?
I was thinking that we've framed leadership in a way that puts it up on a pedestal. And as I've been thinking about it, really, you know, that saying, we are the ones we've been waiting for. It really is about, I don't know, democratizing leadership. In my experience, and working with Grameen and BRAC and the Self-Employed Women's Association in India and others around the world, you may know the leader who started it, Yunus, Abed, Ilabat, but really what I found was the reason that it worked is because each of those women and men embraced their own ability to become change agents in their own families, in their communities. And I think that's part of the magic of the shift right now, is in each of us deciding that, yes, we can express our own power and agency and therefore our leadership ability. But to do that in ways that, that address the trauma, our own failings, the shadow, we've got to do this inner work. And so the inside out theory of leadership is, I think, where the world is evolving. And it doesn't have to be, you know, sitting on a mountaintop meditating, although, you know, that's great. But it is about becoming conscious. And whether it's from Paulo Freire's old ideas on the pedagogy of the oppressed, you know, to develop a consciousness of who you are, self, and then the ability to express your power, that is what I've observed over these last decades leads to transformation. And we make so many judgments about us and them rather than the, you know, the all of us consciousness. I think that's a really important, important shift. I do not think that removing Donald Trump will change a whole lot. We create illusions and say, oh, it's this one person or it's this one group, and just removing, well, you know, say Idi Amin or whoever you cited. We're creating false narratives, I think, there. You know, we're not going to get out of any of our difficulties by treating people, especially sick people who haven't dealt with their trauma in ways that we become the bully.
Thank you, Suzanne. Funmi, could
Yes.
I combine that question? I know you're wanting to react. And,
Yes.
and maybe if you can take with you also in your answer, because it's coming also in the chat, is how do we create more consciousness? So what are some of the ways that you feel that we could create that deeper consciousness? And another question which is related to it is, who are we not listening to now?
Interesting. Very interesting.
They're both coming from the chat.
Okay, let me say how to, you know, who are we not listening to now? It's amazing. And I think it's related to that question of consciousness and something Susan said about power. I think, you know, we've all picked this up from various sources that have reflected over a period of time that of course, the only permanent thing is change, and the loss of power as a result of change is the one thing human beings do not do well at all. And to make this point, I went on field research in 1994 in Liberia. And one of the women who had been affected, she was only 16 at the time, affected by the war and had been taken in by one of the warlords in, you know, in the various scenarios of war, was explaining to me and had then become a refugee. She said, my sister, you know, power is like a prostitute. It cannot reside in one place. If anyone tries to hold on to power in one place, there will be trouble. And that was her own explanation for why the war started. And this issue of conflict, which is the natural part of, human life, it's about that. And so when we try to sew back the strands, of, the peaceful threads in society to try to bring people together, who we're not listening to is more than who we're listening to. Even at this moment in time, they're the people without a seat at the table, proverbial table now. They're the ones who have ideas about their own destiny, but we have better ideas for them. So the self-reflection piece, I think Susan, almost everyone has talked about this, but in a particular way, that unless we, you made the point that, your point about kings, a king is not necessarily a leader. We all sit in various positions of authority. We might not even be leading, but when we are asked to, being able to have a conversation with ourselves about who we represent and what privileges we hold, and who's silent, and whose silence do we want to bring to the fore, in a way that the more people you have around the table that reflect the situation of the moment, which is bound to change. And so it's not the Trump issue alone, it's the Trumpism in the individuals, in the place, in our different countries and in different environments, that we need to deal with through this kind of reflexive conversations. And the more we can ask those questions of ourselves as individuals and ask it in our organizations, and I agree that Scilla and Paul have had those reflexive moments iteratively in the different walks of life. And so there are questions that we need to bring together in order to begin to change the narrative. And the people I see here that are so privileged to meet for the first time, in a sense, seem like the kinds of people who can lead a different kind of conversation that makes us start with ourselves. The individuals start with themselves. Albert Murphy says, what was it that his quote? Situations make leaders, and leaders change when situations change. This situation itself will change, but whilst it lasts, maybe we can have a conversation about the kinds of ways we want to bring the silent constituency around our conversations. There are too many silent people in the world. They're absent from the central institutional spaces where we're having conversations about peace and justice. It's my way of responding to all of those things. But I think this is precisely the kinds of conversation we do not have on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you, Funmi. If I could make a small bridge from the sort of macro way of looking at it to a micro way. And I want to address Mark as, when you look at yourself and in terms of your own development, in terms of developing your feminine qualities that we've been discussing too, and you're looking at, what is my contribution? What is my changing behavior? What are the things that I have changed doing as I have gone on that journey to unlearn and to relearn and to yield into new energies? Would you mind to share something a little bit more in terms of, from a personal perspective, what it has done to you?
I'll be glad to respond, Henri. But I feel humbled by your question, because I think I've been a slow learner. So I'm now 70 years old, and I can say that I've learned some things, but I want to make clear that I've learned them pretty recently. So I've spent a lot of my life not practicing what I'm about to say. And I think that's why it's an insight. And I think that's probably because of the background of privilege that I've had, that I've been able to do things on my own. And going back to what several speakers said, I would often think, oh, there's a problem there, I'm going to do something about it. Or there's an organization that needs to be started, I'm going to start it. Or there's a book that needs to be written, I'm going to write it. And I think the biggest thing I need to change, or have needed to change, and it goes back to some things that Funmi and Scilla and others have said, well, actually Susan and Paul, everybody's touched on it. I can't do this alone. I'm not going to succeed alone. that the entire heroism or leadership model was this, you know, I mean, who do we point to? I mean, even Jim Garrison talked about Alexander the Great, you know, or we talk about Columbus or Napoleon or whatever. That's been the model. And you know, unfortunately, that was my model too, Ari, for a long time. It's like, I need to do this. I'll start this. And I'll just give one specific example. There's a tremendous need now for a transformation around our consciousness around race in America. We have needed this transformation in our consciousness for about 250 years, and we need it desperately now. And so I'm wanting to do something. I'm wanting to contribute. And what I'm realizing is, just look at me. I'm not going to do it alone. I have to do it with partners, and I have to do it with partners who look different than me, talk different than me, know things that I don't know. Going back to what Paul and others and Scilla and Susan have said, I've got to partner with other people, just like Chisano said. Just like Chisano said, I can't, if I try to do this alone, it's the old New Hampshire joke. You know, you're on a road in New Hampshire and you say, how do I get to such and such, to the New Hampshire farmer? And he says, you can't get there from here. Well, I know that I can't get there from here if I try to do it alone. And I think that is so vital, both for people and for nations to understand. So that's my first thought, Henri. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. I have to share a beautiful comment which came up in the chat box, which said, once you had that smile on your face, your feminine was coming out to its fullest. So I want to share that. That was a very beautiful comment to make. Scilla, would you like to sort of reply a bit to where Mark is coming from and related to your own self? I mean, women leadership is for you something which, you know, it's very close to your heart, I know, but it's also very much about that, finding that balance of masculinity and femininity as we develop as leaders. So what are some of the things that you have come across being a woman, or as you have engaged with others in terms of actually elevating ourselves to that higher level of consciousness and to that more balanced way of looking at the issues that we face around us?
Thanks, Henri. I think mainly through making mistakes. The biggest mistakes I've made have been my biggest teachers, I think. You know, they knock you back when you feel foolish or you've done something that clearly wasn't helpful or right. And you have to sit with your inner critic, who's, in my case, sitting on my shoulder and growling at me. So I think one of the best things we can do is some kind of daily practice of self-reflection. In other words, like a helicopter above the head that says, what am I up to here? What am I doing? And that gives us a way of teaching ourselves to be a little bit less puffed up and a bit more self-reflective. But it also gives us the opportunity to do something that I think is really helpful, which is to meet our shadow, our dark sides, our less pretty parts of ourselves. And I think that's almost crucial for a leader, actually. You're talking about leadership. If we can find a way, I'll just share with you, it's a bit, it doesn't put me in a big light, but I'll tell you what happened to me the other day when I was woken up at 3 o'clock in the morning by my inner critic growling at me. And by the way, I think we all have inner critics. And so I tossed and turned for half an hour and couldn't get to any resolution. So I decided to do what I sometimes do, which is to put out 2 cushions. And you may think me mad, but I sat on this cushion. I said to my critic, who happens to be a fire-breathing dragon, why did you wake me up at 3 o'clock in the morning? And then I went and sat on his cushion and spoke in his voice. And he railed at me in the same voice, cursing me out for not getting well prepared or whatever it was. So I went back to my cushion and I said, that is not very helpful. You have to be quite tough with your critic. That is not helpful. What do you want me to know? Because my experience has taught me that my inner critic knows a lot about what I need to know. Anyway, through a process, gradually by questioning him, I got him to give me what I call the gem under the dragon's foot. In other words, to let me discover what I need to know that I've got a blind spot about. In other words, to discover through investigating my dark side, what I need to know to be more helpful, to be more useful. I don't know if that's useful to anybody else, but it's a practice that's worked for me like a charm. And if you don't feel silly doing it, I think it's well worth it.
Very interesting. Maybe a good idea to get some cushions, comfortable cushions to sit on. I want to make a bridge to Paul. So we'll go a slightly different direction, but it's one of the questions which comes out of the chat too, is how do we truly sort of start to work across different sectors and in a truly collaborative mode, but also maybe you can sort of take with you the question is, and how do we deal with those we don't like to deal with? Yeah, because when we are really real leaders, we do reach out, we do bridge, and we dare to put others with other views into the room, even though we may not enjoy it. So can you talk a little bit maybe also about your personal experience to enlighten us?
Yeah, the latter part is the more difficult one, because even myself, I would call myself in a lot of respects judgmental in that sense, and quickly putting an image around a person that has a different opinion than yours is a temptation that we all have, probably driven more by protecting ourselves and not willing to confront. So it is actually healthy to talk to climate deniers, to talk to Trump supporters if you want to, and to find out what drives people or what are their perspectives. And often you come out at a better position if you do that. I think we need to spend more time, and unfortunately the system that we're living in is trying to give you the wrong impression there. We spend more time on celebrating our joint values of what they are and align on those. And these are universal values as we are citizens of planet Earth first and foremost. How do we value nature? How do we value other citizens? What does dignity and respect mean? Why do we want equity for everybody? What does compassion truly mean? And have a discussion about these common values that unite us. And as we talk about some of these challenges that need to be addressed, some of the huge challenges that we now have, how do we go to a regenerative economy? How do we decarbonize? How do we move to the longer term? How do we find an economic system that is more inclusive? How do we do that at a time that global governance seems to be broken down? These are fundamental challenges that are probably bigger than any of us individually can solve. And yes, they are overwhelming. They're overwhelming to me as well. And sometimes I take that in and feel that I'm as much, or if not bigger part of that problem than of that solution. But if you can find people with common values around the different parts of life, be it politics for sure, be it civil society, be it the NGO community, be it the private sector, the academics, by bringing them together around these shared objectives, I think you, by definition, always come out in a better place. And the power of the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, these 17 interdependent goals that have an overall objective to not leave anybody behind, to irreversibly eradicate poverty and do that in a more sustainable and equitable way, is actually the moral framework. That's the power. It puts something out there that 193 countries have signed that we shouldn't forget, to say, we're going to fight for everybody. And we forget that in the daily battles of things. I think if the coronavirus has taught us some things, is that you can't have healthy people on an unhealthy planet, and that relationship with nature is now a little bit clearer, but also that our social contract was incredibly broken. When the dramatic issues of George Floyd came up, which was the straw that broke the camel's back, I thought I was not, would not be discriminating. But it was only after I saw the movie The 13th that I started to realize how broken the judicial system is that these people have to deal with. Then I started to realize that for Black people in the US, the death of George Floyd was not a surprise. It happened 1,066 times last year. The surprise was that all of a sudden so many white people spoke up and said, we need to do something about it. So really trying to be in someone else's shoes, trying to understand that, align on these common objectives, we can solve the things. When Africa needs to create jobs, enormous amounts of youth, it's going to double. Half of the world's youth will be living on that continent, can't create enough jobs themselves, have to import food. So it's quite normal that you start to think about how can you create, for example, a big enough supply of food in Africa itself, done by smallholder farmers, create jobs, include young people. And if you start with an objective like that, you have to work with the government, you have to work with an NGO, you have to, because often these challenges cannot be done alone. But if you bring all these people together, I would argue also for the business community, which is where I grew up by accident, more or less, but I would argue it is also ultimately the most, not only beneficial for planet humanity, but it's also the most profitable solution. We're now in a weird situation that we all work in vacuum and don't want to listen to each other or cast judgments on each other, and continue to incur on any of these sustainable development goals costs that are higher by not implementing them than what it would cost us in the first place to implement. Scilla knows that, conflict prevention and wars, goal number 16, we spend 8 to 10% of our global GDP on things that we could avoid in the first place by not excluding so many people, by excluding women in nearly every country. There's not a country in the world where women have the same rights as men. The rights to education, land rights, rights to financing. We could unlock $25 trillion. And any of these opportunities generate more jobs, better jobs, more resilient jobs, and a future that's more inclusive and more sustainable for generations to come. So forcing these partnerships, and that are obviously based on sharing a common purpose, on a high level of trust, of transparency, of holding each other accountable, are key and important elements. And when they are at play, it's like music playing. It's like a jazz band of the highest order. It's fun to see, it's fun to listen to, but most importantly, it's fun to be part of.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Paul. I want to try and get youth into the room. And I know it's kind of difficult because none of us really belong in that category, I can be honest to say. But one of my observations is that a younger generation is incredibly more conscious than I talk about myself than I was at that age. I see a level of consciousness which is much higher. And you can sort of see it in terms of the theses they write at university and what they are about. And Funmi, I'm sure I'd love to hear from you too, because you're so much closer to younger people at the university too, and what you observe as you compare it maybe when you grew up. And the other thing which I've noticed too is that, and that is happening across the world. So this is not something Western or something. You see it across the world because young people are connecting across boundaries where we're still thinking, as you put it for me so nicely, we're framing the world in our own eyes. Well, young people are framing their own world in very different eyes. Their boundaries are not, our boundaries are not their boundaries. And that's really great to see. And the other thing which you notice too is they're much more balanced in terms of their masculine and feminine qualities. And you can really see a huge difference. And maybe Funmi, if you would like to start, because you're very connected, actually, Suzanne, maybe also because you're teaching as well. And so you're constantly having that conversation and that dynamic, is to bring that into the room as we are here.
No, thank you. Thanks for that. I mean, I've now left the realm of, I was a youth leader in my time. And, sometimes I suddenly remind myself that, I'm speaking for youth. I'm not, I am not part of that constituency anymore. But, interacting with them on a daily basis, you see a different community of actors who are so alive to the realities of their times. And even when I look at, of course, technology is on their side. When I was a student leader, the great lengths we went to drive across the country or to touch base with each other across the region, which we did physically, they can do that now, just at the touch of a button. But there are ideas and the ways in which they connect those ideas across the board, and they recognize diversity, in all its forms, and they are courageous. They're very confident. They're a very confident generation. And when you look at this generation, I am not sure that we have yet developed the tools, if I might even reflect about the United Nations a little bit, as it's now started trying to deal with questions of youth. And in the last few years, we've been talking about that. I think that the two biggest things I notice is the organizing formula. The institutions we create are so bureaucratic, they're so tight, and there are many hoops you have to jump before you can actually do anything. By the time we're planning all of that, whether at the level of an organization or an international entity, a global entity like the United Nations, the young people, they've gone, they've organized. We can't even move beyond the idea that you have to be at this level of experience and at P4 or P5, and therefore you can do that. Now, a young person sits in California or Cape Town, and they've done the very things that we've been trying to organize ourselves to do for many months before we sign those papers. And their life is far less complicated than ours. But the ways they're also questioning us about the future, their future that we have seemed to endanger, are things we have not yet responded to effectively. And if we had more young people in the rooms where we have these meetings on end, we might begin to design a different kind of solution. So borders do not mean the same things to this next generation of leaders, of global leaders, that they mean to us or that they meant to us. Ways of organizing do not mean the same things. And I think there's some barriers that we have to be ready to break if we're going to begin to have the same kinds of conversation with the new leaders on the globe. I'm not even sure that we have yet recognized that somehow they have seized the moment, and that's a place where the world has to look to for a different kind of leadership. Thank you.
I couldn't agree more with you, Funmi. The new ways that younger people have been organizing have been doing it in a more collective fashion and a non-hierarchical fashion. And it prevents the powers that be from decapitating the movement. So if you look at distributed leadership as a model, it's actually so strong, it can't be broken. And the consciousness of equality that is alive and well among all my students, among my younger friends, is so great. As a lesbian, I didn't have the right to get married until 2012. But I had I guess my grandnieces and nephews more accepting than certainly my nieces and nephews, and certainly my siblings. What this generation of young people have done is completely smashed the idea of the gender stereotypes of masculinities and femininities, or the singular, and have expanded it into a grand continuum where they're just tossing it all out, which has implications for everything. And so even maybe the paradigm, Scilla, you're talking about feminine intelligence versus masculine, equally available to everyone, it still sets off that debate of, oh, well, they're bad women and good. I see it in the chat. So partly we have to, I think, look at the values that young people are bringing in, inclusion and equality of participation, of not just seeing color, but being able to name the racism and the hierarchy in colorism. And I think I've been inspired by people who have challenged me to relearn history. mean, this moment that we're in is not just in the United States, where we're finally starting to look at the statues in our history, the Mississippi state flag finally coming down, but it's also spreading around the world, where we're looking at colonialism and imperialism, and how we, in fact, created a society based on exploitation and extraction. And that's the shift that we've all been talking about in terms of the economy. But young people are really occupying the space of social entrepreneurship in a very robust and different way. They want values to be aligned in everything they do from the get-go, not the old model that many of our generation followed, where you play by the rules, you create your wealth, and then you give back in your later years. No, no, no. They're ready to do it right now and express themselves with the full range of artistry.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think there was a lot of applause from everywhere, also in the chat box. So this was a great contribution as such. I just want to go a little bit more into what I try to ask Paul also is, how do we draw people into the room who may have a different opinion? What is a leadership role as we want to reach out and make sure that we have different voices in the room, and we dare therefore also to reconstruct some of the way that we frame our own world, by which we typically engage with those who are similar to ourselves. Mark, can you maybe talk to that, maybe some of your work as well, in terms of the bridging that you have been doing?
Well, did you want Paul to speak first? Paul, you want to go ahead and I'll follow you, or?
No, I think I more or less talked about that already.
Okay.
Yeah, so go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I'll just say that it's funny, before you asked me to do that, I was going to put in a plug for a 35-year-old spoken word rap artist, so folks really could listen to somebody young. And I encourage everybody to go to YouTube and put in Prince and then the letters EA and watch a 4-minute video called "I Am Not Black, You Are Not White." And just take a look at it, because it illustrates exactly what Susan was saying. I spent 6 months trying to write something about race. And then I saw what this young man did in 4 minutes on YouTube. And I thought, well, he's already said it all. So it goes straight to what Susan said. And I think that video captures one of the gifts of young people, is to cut right to the chase and then put your whole self in it, because Prince EA is in it. And what he says, and I'm not black, you're not white. And I'm looking at this screen where supposedly 5 of us would call ourselves white and 1 of us would call ourselves black. And Prince is saying, wait a minute, I don't buy it. And Susan, you were saying that about the M box and the F box. And I think that's true for the left box and the right box, and also the rich box and the poor box. And that's part of what that generation is bringing. And I'm so grateful.
Breaking down the binaries and the polarities. I'd recommend people look at Genesis B in her work. Not only did she do a piece, Trump is a symptom, which challenged me to think, oh yeah, if I just got rid of him, things would be better. She's done Mississippi as a microcosm of America. She's killed the noise about voting. It's, I think we can find probably the answers already to every question that we can ask ourselves now out there. I mean, so many people have written books. If you've listened to these days on Ubiquity, University of Humanity Rising, we've heard more talk about love and trust and answers to every part of, the problem. So we're here now reflecting on this question of leadership, and what are we prepared to yield? And part of what I think is, we've got to give up a lot of these invitations. I was saying before joining this that why don't I just let go and have somebody else come in my place? That's part of, I think, what we need to be able to do is create more opportunities and spaces for people. I applaud the opening of this whole Humanity Rising, because they started with 10 days of listening to Indigenous women's voices, and then young people. And now I guess it's a sea of old people, I don't know. The question of each of us getting to claim the leadership torch is the moment now. And that's part of what I think the Black Lives Movement has been calling on us to show that our silence is violence, and that we also have to cede leadership and follow Black people, Black women in particular. If you look at who has been on the bottom of our economic and social pyramids, we've got to flip it now and really call into question, what am I prepared to give up?
If I could just add on to what Susan said, as you were speaking, Susan, and going back to your question to me, Henri, I'm thinking about the symbolism of monuments coming down, and the fact, Henri, that you work for an organization, Synergos, started by Peggy Delaney, that's about bridging leadership. And I was contrasting the image of a monument with the image of a bridge. And to me, that symbolizes the difference in leadership. The monument says this person, usually man on the top, is the leader. And the bridge is saying, my side of the bridge is kind of worthless without your side. I mean, and every culture, whether it's Swahili with Daraja or Brazilian with Ponche, or French with Pont, or every language has the word bridge. And as you were speaking, Susan, I thought that to me would be a step forward, and is to think more in terms of bridges and less in terms of monuments.
I agree. I think let's reflect on this a little bit, because it's about, when we talk about who's not in the room, and I think Susan was speaking about that, the moment you look at this as a bridge, I think our entire perspective then suddenly changes. And for the past 6 years, I am very quite clear about that. Since around 2014, I have consistently then started examining just cases around me, and I put this to to an entire class. We discuss it. If we don't look at the individual in front of us, the power holder, that person at the top of a vertical hierarchy, and we look at the situation we face first. Every time we look at the situation, the circumstances, that immediate environment and the problem we have, and we next identify everyone that is affected by that problem, there are many people who are not like us, who we see in the room, in the frame immediately. And the moment you bring them together to start solving the problem, of course, and it's true, people will be asking us about this movement, is it collective leadership or not? There's something about distributed leadership that is so clear about responding to the issues of the moment. But what therefore that means is that the moment you manage to solve that problem, the faces of the movement or the individuals who emerge into leadership change. So that the fact that change is allowed to happen, and the fact that others are allowed to emerge to lead, begins to do what Mark is talking about. And I totally agree. I've challenged myself so much during this period, what Susan was saying, that every time I have to have a conversation or come into a forum like this, I have to ask, what's the basis of my own influence and power here? Am I able to use that personal power to become the voice of something that does not belong to me properly? And why is that person to whom this belongs not speaking for themselves? So why am I speaking for others that could rightfully speak for themselves on that issue? And that's my own point of reflection at this particular moment.
Thank you, Funmi. I think, Scilla, you wanted to contribute? You're on mute. You're on mute right now.
I just wanted to bring in something about the mind and the heart to this conversation, because our experience is that when we're in the mind and we're in disagreement or even having a discussion, the mind tends to say, I'm right and you're wrong. That's where we put ourselves. But when we can sink or move into the heart and actually listen to what the other person or the other set of opinions are really saying and what's going on for them. If we really listen to the extent that we could then feed back to them what they said, then something changes, because we and they, if we both do it, can move to the heart, and the heart says, oh my goodness, is that how you feel? And once we get to that point where we can imagine what an opponent feels, then we've got a bridge, which comes back to your bridge, Henri, that instead of having a monument, which is the mind, I think, we can move to that bridge that says, I'm connected with you because I can understand how you feel. That's all I wanted to add.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much. And I don't know if there's somebody who wants to still contribute to the discussion. Otherwise, I'll try and sort of wrap things up and give a few reflections from my side. If there is.
I just wanted to say, the only thing I wanted to add was the opponent is in our minds, not in the minds of the opponent. It is a lack of willingness of us to perhaps understand. It is a characterization of people. We should really start from a mindset that if someone has what is perceived to be a different opinion, he has a enormous knowledge and depth that actually adds to the equation. And most of people that we perceive to be opponents, in reality, when we enter into the deep listening, don't turn out to be opponents at all. It's us that make that separation, probably more so than the other individuals. So that's a starting point that we need to overcome, myself included. And it's important that for any issue that we want to solve, whatever the issue is, that we put the people in the room of whom we are talking. How can we solve the issues of the 800 million people that go to bed hungry without listening to them, or the homeless without bringing them in the room, or the people currently in the informal economy, the 60%, without listening to them is to me inconceivable. So making them, those are the people that need to sit in the middle of the table. When you do this, and at least from my experience, the discussions are so much better, so much richer, and the outcomes that you come to have so much more sticking power.
Yeah.
Yes, and absolutely. And I think this sort of, it's part of unlearning, and it is part of deep listening. And we talk about it a lot, and it's rather complicated to do. Because we are indeed, framing the world in the way that we've been brought up. And so actually going deeper into self is not an easy route to go. And it happens because at 3 o'clock you get woken up and you find yourself sitting on a pillow and then sitting on the other pillow and getting to know yourself better, or other ways in which you face yourself after a meeting or after a discussion you've had with somebody and realizing that you didn't actually really listen deeply to the other person and didn't really understand where the other person was coming from, mostly because we're so ready to give our own opinion on something, and we're so ready to give an opinion on something. That's something for me, definitely, I need to unlearn a lot, because I like to get into the dialogue, I like to get into the discussion. And at the same time, debate is great. And maybe we are too kind sometimes too. We need to have good debate, because debate leads to new wisdom of finding things out in a new way. We were taught that not in January by somebody who really said, you guys are just too nice to each other. You're from this non-for-profit world. You're all kind of kind to each other. You should have more debate, bring in the discussion, bring in others into the room, and really go on an exploration and actually seeing that things emerge without you having to be the one who does the emerging. And that's really great too. And seeing actually what enormous amount of power there is in people around you, whether you're in a senior position in a corporate or otherwise. And what I think what is really needed too, and we discussed it as well, is we really need new organizing principles. Some of them were around already. At Synergos, we change our way of moving away from hierarchy into new, more agile environment, empowering people. And then we had one of our board members from the Philippines and said, well, I've been in these community organizations, and that's how we've been organizing all along. This is nothing new. And I was like, yes, that's how it is, because it's actually very powerful. I think Suzanne kind of said it too. It's actually a very powerful principle. And it's also very powerful in terms of being able to stand up. Because if we elevate our leaders on that pedestal, they are at the same time our weakest link. And that's really how it is. So the more we have shared leadership, the less the weakest link actually comes out. So it becomes a real shared leadership. And I think that's something I would like to take out of this. I would love to take out of this more that it is not necessarily, and I say not necessarily having more women leaders, but having people who are more balanced and who have found that balance in themselves, and through that balance in themselves are able to contribute more to the world in which we live and the changes that we want to see. But again, it starts with self and going into that self-exploration and finding that that might be a tough one as we meet our dark side many a times over. There was a very nice comment from the chat, and that is, and it was Rachel. I don't know if she's still there. Yes, she is, because I can see it. And she said much earlier on, what we really need is a beautiful patchwork tapestry of heartfelt, high impact people. And I want to sort of maybe leave it at that. Bridging across, bridging within ourselves, developing our feminine or our masculine, bridging in terms of getting youth into the room, bridging in terms of getting the other voice into the room and daring to listen to where that person or that particular group is coming. That requires a lot of ability to be vulnerable. And maybe finally what it also needs, and I'm really happy for all the panelists of being here today, is creating a place in which we felt there's a place of trust. So you could come in with your full self, share some of your personal experiences like many of you actually did, and actually finding how very interconnected we are as human beings, coming in with leadership coming from different directions. So I'm extremely thankful to the panel, but I'm also very thankful to all those who've listened and who've been part of us over the past almost 2 hours. A lot of questions have come in, almost impossible to follow everything and every discussion, but it's been enlightening. And I thank you also, Jim, as we sort of hand over to you to kind of round it off and then take us into, I think, tomorrow and on. So thanks very much, everybody.
Henri, thank you so much. I've been listening with rapt interest and attention, and I must say, as having gone through 47 days now, I think this panel today was the first panel where there were no presentations. You just went directly into dialogue. And I think you distilled what Raquel was calling for, and that is heartful, high impact leadership. So I just want to acknowledge your mastery at moderation, Henri, and the quality of the people that you brought to our collective presence. It's been profoundly moving. You've really revealed both the complexity of leadership and the dynamic transmutation of leadership that's emanating from our young. And I think that's a very important thing for us to consider. And I want to just also just note, Mark, my good friend for many decades, when you were speaking about having learned lessons very recently that you weren't mindful of over the years, you spoke for me, and I think for many men, I think in particular, we were trained that if you see a problem, you just dive in like Sir Galahad and solve it. And what I think we're all learning is that, in the end, it's the bridge. It's not the monument. It's the bridge. And as Scilla, you said, that bridge, it emanates from the bottom. And Funmi, the point you made that it comes in from the margins. And I think those are very wise considerations. And, it reminded me of Chekhov's great line in one of his poems that it's drop by drop that we squeeze the slave out of ourselves. And I think this generation, among many other things, is one of those transitional generations where what seems so normal and natural and conventional, even God-given, 60, 70 years ago, is now being revealed by the critical nature of our time as to be inadequate at the very minimum and destructive when implemented in an unconscious way. And so I think, the point that you made, Susan, I think is so profound that all of us are being challenged with what are we going to give up? What are we going to allow to fall away? What kinds of leadership do all of us need to embody that we may have never considered before, and in fact, even thought ridiculous or absurd? And I think that's the gift of this panel, is that the leadership in the future is going to be both highly collaborative, but also in a form that probably we can't even currently imagine, such as the nature of our crisis and what's being now called forth from all of us. And again, the way each of you have spoken and presenced these complexities and these challenges has been so inspirational. I just want to thank you very, very deeply. Tomorrow, we're going to go to India for a dialogue with a young woman who's emerging as a spiritual leader, Sadhvi Saraswati, and have just a pause in our continuum so that we can single out a single individual and hear what they have to say, in this case, about the profound interconnectivity between spiritual growth and social justice, and how those two opposite sides of the coin need to be integrated in very profound ways. So thank you, everyone. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same station, 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock p.m. Central European time, here on Zoom, and obviously live streamed through our channel partners. Henri, Paul, Funmi, Scilla, Mark, Susan, thank you so much. Goodbye, everyone.